to finish up on that last section, again, if organisms are more closely related, their genes will be more alike and will have fewer changes between their genome sequence in their particular genes. If organisms are more distantly related, there will be more genetic changes in the DNA sequence of a particular gene. And that's simply indicating that organisms are more closely related, their common ancestors in the more recent past, versus organisms that are more distantly related, like the human and the frog, and their common ancestor is much further in the past. So molecular biology provides strong evidence that all life forms are related. For example, all forms of life use the same language of DNA and RNA, and we looked at this when we looked at the genetic code for gene expression. So the genetic code is how genes are translated into polypeptides, which become proteins, and is essentially universal for life on Earth. And that was the idea that when we looked at, in this case, protein synthesis, right? A gene or an allele, a small section on the DNA molecule gets transcribed. Remember, in the nucleus of eukaryotic cells, producing the RNA molecule, which gets modified, becomes the mRNA molecule that leaves the nucleus. And during translation, remember the ribosome, small and large unit, subunits attached to the mRNA molecule. Oh, my cursor's going nuts. And then the tRNA molecules bring in the appropriate amino acids. And then the building polypeptide chain gets modified, gets its correct three-dimensional shape or conformation, becoming the functional protein. So this process of gene expression using the genetic code is universal. So that leads to the fact, or points to the fact, that life evolved a very long time ago, and we had a common origin in terms of the ancestral organism or organisms that led to all living things today. So, for example, the genetic code allows bacteria to be engineered and transformed with human genes so that the bacteria will express the human genes and produce human proteins, for example, like insulin and human growth hormone. That is then harvested from these transformed bacteria in the lab to produce insulin and human growth hormone for human use. More evidence, vestigial structures. So vestigial structure is a remnant structure or feature that served a function in an organism's ancestor or ancestors, but is no longer really functional in the living species today or in the descendants. So, for example, the small pelvis and hind leg bones in whales today were or are modified vestigial structures of pelvis and hip bones, and rear hind leg bones in their ancestors, which had functional rear legs. If you go back far enough, they were functional on land. Remember, we talked about that sequence of evolutionary changes, the descent and modification leading to the whales of today. So their remnant hip and leg bones are vestigial structures. For example, eye remnants in blind species of cave fishes. Their ancestors that first went into the caves had functional eyes, but the cave fishes today have remnant eyes and they're actually blind. Or the fact that we get goosebumps or goose pimples in humans. That's because we have small little muscles attached to our hair follicles in our skin, and when those muscles contract, it causes the hair follicles and the hairs to stand upright, and that really serves no function for us today. But if you consider something like a cat, when this happens to the cat and their hair stands on end, the cat gets a nice fluffy layer of air trapped into their fur coat that helps insulate them and keep them warm. or makes them appear larger, like when they get into a cat fight. So in ancient humans that were hairier, the goosebumps and having the fur stand on end had an actual use, a function, but no longer today. So these muscles, called the rector pili muscles, are remnant vestigial structures in humans. And there's many other examples, like, our appendix or our wisdom teeth, which are almost vestigial structures in humans, those sorts of things. So homology also explains embryological developmental stages in vertebrates. So if you consider different backboned organisms and you look at their embryological development, there are some similarities that are homologies that point to a common ancestry evolutionarily. So during development, all vertebrate embryos actually do have a tail and what are called pharyngeal pouches or pharyngeal throat pouches. Sometimes they're called gill slits. So if we look at an embryo of a chicken and a human, we both have a tail and these pharyngeal pouches. As we develop embryologically, the human loses most of the tail and they get just a little remnant, the coccyx, the tailbone. The chicken gets a relatively short little tail. But if we look at another vertebrate, for example, a lizard, they retain the tail embryologically. The pharyngeal pouches in us and in the chickens become parts of our jaw and ear bones. But if you consider, say, a fish, which is actually a vertebrate, it retains its tail, and the pharyngeal pouches become the gill slits that they use for respiration. So evolutionary trees or phylogenies. So Darwin was the first to really visualize history of life as a tree with patterns of descent from a common ancestral trunk, meaning the first organisms of life on Earth, to the millions of species that are living today and or that have gone extinct. So this is an evolutionary tree. And this is actually one of the early sketches of Darwin showing a relationship between living organisms, all branching from a common ancestor. So homologies, both anatomical and molecular, are used to help determine the branching sequences, speciation event sequences of an evolutionary tree. So this is an evolutionary tree that's referred to as a phylogeny. We'll get into that in more detail later on. But it's showing that the more recently evolved homology or homologous traits are shared by smaller groups of organisms. So if we look at this example of different vertebrates, on the far left is the common ancestor. So this is also a time scale, so that's in the distant past. As we move to the right, the modifications and the changes are more recent, and the more recent changes are shared among the more recently evolved groups and the more closely related groups. So the common ancestor to this entire lineage of these organisms is on the far left here. And that's a common ancestor to all of these organisms. So number one here is a certain anatomical or molecular homology that's common to all of them. And this is the oldest group here, the lungfishes. And then the modification that separates the fishes from the rest of these organisms is the development of 4 legs. Tetrapod means 4 limbs. So amphibians to hawks and other birds have 4 limbs. The next development is a type of embryological structure, the egg, fertilized egg, and the liquid around it called the amnion. If you ever heard of amniocentesis, it's an analysis of the amniotic fluid. So the development of the egg that's retained within the female after fertilization, and the amnion that's supporting the developing fetus. That's found in the mammals all the way to the birds. Amphibians don't do that. They reproduce, and the female lays her eggs externally that are then fertilized by the male frogs. So that's the most recent development of these 3 events. Okay. Then as we go further and further along, the advent of feathers is a homologous trait shared by the groups on the right here, after here number 5 and 6. So ostriches, hawks, and other birds have feathers that these other vertebrates do not have. And it also then shows the shared homologies. It shows also the relationships between these organisms. Right? Ostriches, which are actually birds, are most closely related to hawks and other birds than they are to crocodiles. And then crocodiles and birds are more closely related to themselves than they are to lizards and snakes. And those guys are all more closely related to themselves than they are to mammals and so forth. Okay? We'll look at more phylogenies, evolutionary trees, as we continue. So natural selection as the driving force for evolution. So Darwin noted that artificial selection, the selective breeding of domesticated plants and animals to push and promote desirable traits, was important in understanding evolutionary change and how natural selection works. So Darwin studied breeding of plants and animals, and that helped him put together his concept of nature, natural selection being the mechanism for evolution. Excuse me. So in the domestication of animals and plants and the selective breeding of these organisms by humans in agriculture, or breeding of say, pet dogs, that's artificial selection. It's humans choosing which traits are favorable. With natural selection, it's nature selecting which traits are beneficial to organisms. So artificial selection has two essential components: variation among individuals, that in this case humans can select for. Okay, for example, variation among the ancestral ancestor of the dogs of today. We want a nice small dog, so you breed the smaller individuals within a population of dogs, and then their offspring, you breed the smaller ones, and then their offspring, you breed the smaller ones. Eventually you get to a small Chihuahua. On the opposite end, if you breed the larger ones, and then you breed their offspring, the larger ones and the larger ones, etc., you get to things like larger dogs, Great Danes and or St. Bernards. All of the dogs that are alive today, all the different breeds, are actually the same species. They're just accentuating, or their differences, their physical characteristics are just accentuated because of human artificial selection. But they are still the same species. Same thing with this thing on the right. Cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts are actually within the same species. They're just highly modified variations of the ancestor, which is actually a wild mustard. Excuse me. So variation among individuals is necessary for artificial selection to occur, and natural selection as well. And then heritability. These variations have to be heritable. In other words, size in individuals has to be able to be passed on to their offspring. Otherwise, you can't have natural selection or artificial selection of working or functioning. So, for example, the domestication and accentuation of the size of the chicken and even how fast they grow has led to really large chickens of today, essentially, versus their much smaller relatives in the not too distant past. So through artificial selection, and even through the use of things like growth hormone, but forget that, artificial selection selected for larger, faster growing chickens, bigger ones as well. On the right here is the wild ancestor to modern corn, something called teosinte, which is still found growing in the wild in south central Mexico. And where's my cursor? Here we go. Through artificial selection, humans have selected the nice large ears of corn, which is technically the female part of the mature cornflowers. And what you have on top here is the male part, which are called catkins, that produce the pollen that pollinates the female part that leads to the modern large ears of corn on the cob. You could forget about that part, but just notice that the modern corn of today is a modification through artificial